Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what is going to be the final video in my Elden Ring series. I've enjoyed the series immensely. It's been a ton of fun to edit, a ton of fun to play, and really quite gratifying to see the level of response I've received. When I started this series, I had, I think it was 17 subscribers, and I now have nearly 300, which that feels pretty good, not gonna lie, especially given the number of nice comments and things that I've been receiving on the videos, because I do read pretty much all the comments. In order to cap off the series, I decided to do this little video, which is basically just my final thoughts on the game. I thought, some people might find this interesting. I don't really have the time. I spent 30 hours over the last 4 days editing together the Millennia video that will have come out just before this one. I was hoping to potentially have a bit more time to edit this video, but ultimately I don't, I'm afraid, so this is primarily going to be a little bit rudimentary in terms of the editing. I'm basically just going to slap this voiceover on top of some B-roll footage I recorded of one of my fights against Radagon and the Elden Beast. The purpose of this video is to just give my final thoughts. I'm going to structure it fairly loosely. It's going to be a bit of a ramble, me just sort of talking about things I wanted to mention, points, observations, both from my initial playthrough and from the subsequent playthroughs that I've done. I'm currently on my 5th playthrough. I have beaten the game with intelligence, strength, dex, and faith, and I'm currently working on something that frankly was just something I wanted to do, which was dual wield rot and poison daggers. That's actually turning out to be a lot of fun, although given that the final boss is completely immune to both of those, that might turn out to be very challenging, but we'll see. Overall thoughts on Elden Ring. I think it's very good in some places, and really falls down in others. First, I think I want to talk about the world. I think the world is the biggest draw of Elden Ring. It's a huge part of what people were praising about the game when it first came out. It was a huge part of the selling points of the game, and it was overall just a big part of the huge, overwhelmingly positive response to this game, particularly at first. And I think it's important to note that the overall response to the game, as well as the response that I experienced, was overwhelmingly positive initially, and got more and more negative as I got further into the game. The world of Elden Ring is expansive. That is by far the best word to use to describe it. It is vast. In many cases, when I was playing through it initially, it felt never-ending. The fact that you don't know the constraints of the world initially was a phenomenal decision. It really was. The fact that you can just keep wandering through and you think, okay, we must be nearly at the end of the game now, and then suddenly you stumble across an entire vast area that you didn't even know existed between you and your goal, or even completely tangential to your goal, and you find yourself exploring that for hours, and that in and of itself is absolutely incredible. Exemplified in many ways by the underground locations. Now, don't get me wrong, finding Caelid, that felt pretty amazing. Caelid was a truly astounding location. I first found Caelid by being teleported there. So when I stepped out of this cave to find myself in this bizarre looking landscape, and then I pulled up the map to see that I was miles away from anywhere I'd been at that stage of the game, that was an incredible experience. That was absolutely phenomenal, but it is more than matched by the experience I felt when I first descended into Siofra. When I went down the Siofra well and found myself in this incredibly beautiful underground environment, and then pulled up the map only to discover that there was a whole second map that existed below the first one, that this world was so huge that they had to put it on 2 levels. It all blended together to provide this incredible experience of wonder and of the joys of discovery. Unfortunately, that was short-lived. I say short-lived, it lasted probably for the first 40 to 50 hours, so not really that short. But as the game went on, and as I got into the later and later game areas, I discovered that even though the world of Elden Ring is very large, there's actually not a lot to find there. For me, a huge part of the joy of exploring is the possibility of discovering interesting things. Interesting items, cool new enemies, cool new bosses, cool new zones, but the problem is, as time went on, I just discovered that so many of these things were repeated. The catacombs were recurring tile sets that contained the same bosses I'd fought before, the same enemies I fought before, and items that gave marginal boosts to builds that weren't my own. By the end of the game, I'd come to the realization that any individual catacombs probably holds nothing of interest to me. There was simply nothing to find in the catacombs, so there was a decent chance none of them were worth exploring. Because exploration for exploration's sake isn't something I'm really interested in. When I'm exploring, there needs to be something to discover, and I learned by the end that in Elden Ring, often, there isn't. One thing I did want to mention, which I've not seen a lot of people discuss, is that I actually think From Software might have missed a bit of a trick when it came to designing Elden Ring. From Software has branched out twice since the release of Dark Souls 1 from the established Dark Souls formula. Once in Bloodborne and once in Sekiro, and good God did that work out incredibly well in both cases. Now, some of you might be thinking that Bloodborne's not that much of a branch out from the Dark Souls formula. That's in hindsight. You have to bear in mind, at the time, only Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 had been released, and Bloodborne was a wild departure with its much faster paced combat and its increased focus on the action aspect of the game. Bloodborne shaped Dark Souls, not the other way around, and Bloodborne itself was a phenomenal success. Same with Sekiro. I was expecting something similar when it came to Elden Ring, but with a more open world approach, but as it turns out, no, it's pretty much just open world Dark Souls, which is fine and is solid and is fun, don't get me wrong. I love me some Dark Souls. However, I do think that they could have potentially branched out a bit more, incorporated a few more elements that are often present in other open world games, things like more traditional side quests, friendly settlements is a very good example, because these things could have added a lot of narrative weight to areas such as the catacombs, which involve repeated tile sets, repeated bosses, which could have made them stand out and be a bit more interesting, could have made certain catacombs more memorable purely by adding some kind of story to them. Just to take an example that I thought of the other day, I feel like it could have been interesting. Let's say we take an example of a catacombs with a recurring boss, with recurring enemies, and make it a bit more interesting by adding a story. Let's say in Limgrave, you run into a small town. Not a lot of NPCs, maybe a couple, a few who don't really do very much, and then one notable one who tells you about a problem they've been having. Godric is trying to charge them taxes, or has been preying upon the village, or is in some conflict with the village. The village is fighting back, and Godric has sent an enemy, again, let's take a recurring boss such as a Crucible Knight, and sent them with a small contingent of soldiers to threaten the town. This group are holed up in a catacomb nearby. You get sent to the catacombs, you battle your way through a series of the regular basic Godric soldiers, the kind of enemies you fight everywhere else in the game, and then you get to the end of the catacombs and you discover the boss at the end, a mad pumpkinhead. But then you think to yourself, hang on a minute, well, I was sent here to defeat a Crucible Knight. I just fought a pumpkinhead, what's going on? So you head back to the village to find it destroyed, burned, the people dead, and standing in the middle of the chaos is the Crucible Knight. You then have a boss fight with the Crucible Knight, and that's the end of the quest. By taking bosses that are repeated and enemies that are repeated in an environment that is repeated and simply adding a story to it, that encounter becomes much more memorable. And I feel like this is an approach that From Software might have overlooked as a result of their dedication to the more traditional Dark Souls formula of NPCs showing up in one location and then teleporting to other locations after you interact with them. This formula is solid and works perfectly fine in Dark Souls, but I think by sticking to it, they did limit themselves. If I were designing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, an open world one, and every single encounter was intended to be combat, that could work perfectly fine, but it would be more limited. than potentially branching out. And given the success that From Software has had branching out in the past, I think that could have been a great thing to see in Elden Ring. That's obviously just my thoughts. I'm not saying I'm necessarily disappointed that they didn't do that, but I'm just trying to think of ways that they could potentially have made some of the issues with Elden Ring, most notably the repeated environments and enemies, more interesting without adding too much development time. That being said, I feel like next, and by far the most important thing for me to talk about, are the bosses in this game. The bosses in Elden Ring were disappointing. Some of them are solid, some of them are decent, a couple of them are great, but many of them are, I think, poorly designed, in some cases overtuned, in some cases undertuned, and in many cases just put together in a manner that feels more frustrating than fun. A lot of the criticisms I could make of the bosses are criticisms that have been made by many people before, and I feel like I don't need to add to that pile. I'll just briefly mention that yes, I agree that many of the bosses are overly aggressive, many of the bosses have combos that are too long with openings that are too short to provide a decent flow, and overall are of lower quality than previous entries in the series. Most notably, the last two games that From Software put out, Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, had unbelievably fantastic bosses. The bosses were the absolute highlights of those games. Now, I have my problems with Dark Souls 3. I was somewhat disappointed by Dark Souls 3 when it first came out because of the changes that they've made and the clear inspiration they took from Bloodborne that I felt removed some of the formula that made the original Dark Souls great. But the thing that absolutely did not disappoint me in any way were the bosses. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are truly phenomenal. There are relatively few poor ones and so many incredible ones, and Sekiro was just a step up from that. Now, obviously Sekiro is a very different kind of game, but good God did they nail the bosses in that game. Elden Ring, on the other hand, has almost no standouts. Malekith, for me, is the absolute pinnacle. I feel like Malekith is incredible. After having fought Rykard multiple times with multiple different builds, I have to say I think Rykard's pretty damn great as well. My initial impressions of Radagon definitely bore out. I felt when I fought him with my two melee characters and with my Faith character, honestly, he was pretty fantastic across the board. I liked him in every fight that I did. It's a bit of a shame that he's tied to the Elden Beast, unfortunately, but hey, that's the game they made, and Radagon is still pretty damn good. Not quite as good as Malekith, in my opinion, but definitely top tier, and one that I will be keen to fight in many future playthroughs. One thing I do want to note about Elden Ring is that in previous Souls titles, Sorcerer has gathered something of a reputation as being a bit of an easy mode. The reasoning for this is actually pretty damn straightforward. Ranged combat is generally more effective than melee combat, and the Sorcerer is the highest damage ranged combatant. That's pretty much all there is to it. In general, this has been true, not quite to the same extent as some people claim. The only time when I would consider Sorcerer to have been truly broken was when Dark Bead came out in Dark Souls 1. That spell was ridiculous. But Sorcerer has always been, on average, easier than playing a melee character. However, it has never been anywhere near as true in any FromSoft game as it was in Elden Ring. Again, barring specifically Dark Bead, which was nonsense, and I don't know what the fuck they were thinking when they made that spell. But anyway, so many encounters in Elden Ring simply seem to be incapable of dealing with ranged combat. In particular, there is an overwhelming number of bosses that seem to favour a sort of jaunty, slow walk to initiate combat, which makes for a dramatic, menacing approach when faced with a melee combatant, but when faced with a ranged combatant, particularly a high damage one like a Sorcerer, lets me take off half their fucking health before they've crossed the room, and that isn't great. The prevalence of this strange sort of slow walk strategy, as well as in some cases bosses such as Commander O'Neill, who literally are incapable of closing distance rapidly, is something that wasn't present in previous games, and that made some of these encounters quite a lot less exciting. It's a minor detail, relatively, because obviously I can just switch to a melee weapon and genuinely have fun with the boss that way, but it was something that was a bit of a disappointment for me on my initial playthrough. The final thing I want to talk about is honestly something that I think is pretty much unequivocally a positive. The build variety in this game is phenomenal. I have spent so much time since completing the game researching items, researching cool things, coming up with concepts. I haven't felt this inspired to try so many different builds since Dark Souls 1. There are so many weapons that function in different and interesting ways. There are so many different ways that you can approach different challenges in the game. Honestly, that to me is by far the biggest strength of Elden Ring. Because the world, while impressive, is only impressive once. Once you're familiar with the world, it loses some of its charm, but this does not. Because there's so many weapons, I'm never going to be able to try them all. One minor criticism I would say that goes hand in hand with build variety is that even though the actual builds, in terms of the way they play and in terms of the way you put your items together, are different, the builds in terms of your stats are not. In my experience, from what the playthroughs that I've had since completing the game, the best thing to do most of the time is just get the basic stats needed to wield the weapon you want to wield, and then put every single other point into either health for, well, health, or endurance for carrying capacity. That's it. I mean, the damage of your weapons is actually pretty damn respectable, even with only the basic stats required to wield them, and the amount of damage endgame bosses deal practically necessitates an incredibly high health stat. That's a common criticism, and it's one that I absolutely share. I don't feel like you should be required to boost your vigor to potentially 50 or 60 in many cases, simply to be able to survive a couple of hits from endgame level bosses. It also means things like the Dragon Great Shield Talisman become overwhelmingly useful for practically every build. You don't need to be a tank to want that thing. That thing's fucking crazy. 20% damage reduction. Absolutely gargantuan, and is an incredible help for so many different builds. So that, to me, is one detriment against the build variety, but, again, it is well outweighed by the sheer absurd number of different weapons and approaches that the game provides. Now, obviously this is a FromSoft game, so I'm going to be playing the shit out of it. I've already got 200 hours or so in it, which I know is probably peanuts compared to a lot of other people, but I imagine that number will be growing substantially over the next few months. My overall opinion on Elden Ring is that it has moments of brilliance, but it just fails in a couple of key aspects that unfortunately make it, I would say, on average, slightly worse than Dark Souls 3. You have to bear in mind, Dark Souls 3 is pretty damn great. So as much as it sounds like I'm super down on Elden Ring, it's still a FromSoft game, which automatically means it's head and shoulders above most other games. The next series I'm going to be doing is Hollow Knight. I've already started playing through that on stream, and I've already, by the time this video comes out, I will probably have already edited quite a few Hollow Knight videos. So if you're interested in Hollow Knight, or if you just want to see me play more video games, please give that a look. I've played a bit of Hollow Knight before this playthrough, but not a ton. So this is a mostly blind playthrough, is my Hollow Knight run. And having played a bunch of it so far, honestly, it is a ton of fun. So if you're interested in that, those videos will be continuing on pretty much the same schedule as this one. In terms of future Elden Ring content, I have been thinking about a few challenge runs that I've potentially been planning on doing. We'll see how those go. I've already recorded some content for the challenge runs, but the question of when I'm going to have the time to edit it is definitely up in the air. It's not going to be a long-running series like this one. It's probably going to be a series of shorter videos detailing the specific key elements of the challenge. So if you're looking for more Elden Ring content, there is going to be some. It's just not going to be anywhere near as regular as it has been so far. Other than that, I think all that's left for me to say is that I have been the Lone Ponderer, and this has been my blind playthrough of Elden Ring. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.